God has visited his people. We heard 3 stories about how God has visited his people. And God continues to visit his people in our actions of our daily lives. How many of you know CPR? How many of you don't know what CPR is? Okay, it is simply compressions on the chest. Is that correct, Doctor? Thank you. I have another question for you, so don't go anywhere. Okay. It's compressions on the chest. Now, how many of you, faced in a situation, think you could save someone's life? I could give last rites. It's a joke, okay? Lighten up. Anyway, so a friend of mine recently, he had a fainting spell, and ultimately his heart stopped for 18 seconds. I asked him, I said, "Did you see the light?" And he said, "No, all I saw was darkness." And I said, "This does not bode well for you." And he said, "You're right. I promised to change my ways." And I said, "Well, what did they do? How did they revive you?" And he said, "Well, since my heart stopped," it's not arrhythmic. What is it called when your heart, because it wasn't out of sync, it was completely, so what's the, yeah, that word. I had Richard Burns at the 5 p.m. last night. He helped me on that one. Anyway, and so they couldn't use paddles. So they couldn't shock him back because that only works if you're out of sync, apparently. So they had to, and luckily for my friend, there was someone in the ambulance there who was able to do that for him and bring him back to life. Since he's now got a pacemaker and he's living happily ever after, I said, "Well, how long did the honeymoon last with your wife?" And he said, "As soon as he got me home, the next day she came into the bedroom and she said, 'Aren't those your shoes in the kitchen?'" So it lasted about 24 hours. And he said, "I've got a heart condition now. I can't." It didn't last long. But luckily for my friend, there was again somebody there who could put a little pressure, provide some CPR, and ultimately save his life. For my friend, God had truly visited his people that day. Now, granted, some of us more cynically might say, well, the nurse was simply doing her job. I've never met a nurse, I personally, now I'm sure they're out there, who is simply just doing her job or his job. My experience is they all have a truly see themselves responding to almost a divine vocation of healing. So I think it was a little more than that. But she applied the CPR, that pressure, which gave him life. I think sometimes in our lives we need spiritual CPR. And I think today in the first reading from 1 Kings and in the gospel, we hear about spiritual CPR. Now, what's spiritual CPR? Well, first of all, Elijah in 1 Kings, he's been living with this lady who's been giving him hospitality for quite some time now. And we didn't hear this today in the story today, but, when Elijah first showed up, he's not the easiest house guest. He shows up and he starts telling her what he wants her to do. But she does. She gives him hospitality, provides for his needs. And now all of a sudden her son, obviously some respiratory problem, is getting worse. He's dying. Elijah prays to God and says, "Is this the way that you're going to repay this woman who's done so much for me and ultimately for you as your servant?" God visiting his people once again. And so Elijah has compassion and mercy. Then he prays, there's the P, ultimately then, which I assume, because 1 Kings was written in the 7th century BC. So I'm assuming laying on the kid's chest 3 times is the 7th century BC equivalent of CPR. But he lays on the kid's chest. Ultimately, that pressure once again brings life. And this child who is the only son of a widow, and thus her livelihood is restored to life. That restoration is the R. Compassion, prayer, restoration. In the gospel, Jesus does some CPR as well. Just like Elijah, he too encounters a widow who has lost her only son, her only source of survival. He too has pity. Now, it doesn't say he prays, but since he's God, he doesn't have to pray out loud. But he puts a little pressure, at least it says, on the coffin. He stops it. And ultimately, by calling forth the young man, restoration once again is brought back for him. Rejuvenation in his own life. God has visited his people in those actions. I think if we look at our world today and our lives, sometimes we're in our relationships in need of a little CPR. But we've got to first of all have compassion. We've got to have pity, as the word says. We've got to have concern for that person. I think it should always begin with prayer. But ultimately, it's putting some pressure. Sometimes breathing into something so that once again life can be restored. So that for those people, they once again see witness that God has visited his people. Today we're going to take up a second collection ordered throughout the diocese by the bishop for the people of Oklahoma who endured the recent tornadoes. And I think in many ways that is a way that we can look at spiritual CPR. It's a lived example, right, for each and every one of us. Anyone who's seen the pictures or has experienced someone losing their homes, their livelihoods, it's hard not to have compassion and mercy on such a situation as that. Hopefully your hearts have been moved as they were moved at Joplin. Second, I think it requires prayer. Not only praying for them, but praying how we will respond. And lastly, I think it's putting a little pressure in the sense of how are we going to react so that we can once again bring life to a different situation. Perhaps that will mean putting some money in the collection plate as the basket goes along. But perhaps it means making a trip, just as so many of the people of Missouri made trips to Joplin in order to go and help those people in need. There's many ways in which we can do spiritual CPR. But I think today, in so many situations, in our schools, in our workplaces, in our families, there are situations that seem lifeless. And I think regardless of the situation, if we do those three things, follow the pattern of compassion, prayer, and recitation, once again, we will give evidence that God has visited his people.